I never liked basements. Something about descending beneath the earth always unsettled me, yet there I was, in the dimly lit stairwell of my newly bought century-old house, clutching a flashlight with sweaty hands. The realtor had casually mentioned the basement was partially finished and had lots of potential. That potential, I would soon discover, was for horror. It started innocuously enough. The wooden steps creaked underfoot as I descended, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the musty darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. At the bottom, the light flickered across old furniture draped in white sheets, looking like specters frozen in time. I was there to check the foundations for signs of damage, but a metallic clang from deeper within the basement drew my attention. I hesitated, a chill running down my spine. It was probably just the house settling, I rationalized, or perhaps some small animal that had made its way inside. I pressed on, curiosity edging out my fear. The basement stretched further back than I had anticipated, branching off into smaller rooms and alcoves filled with relics of the past, boxes of old photographs, rusted tools, and antique furniture. In one corner, a vintage radio sat on a desk, coated in dust. As I passed, static suddenly burst from the speakers, making me jump. The dial wasn't even plugged in. Heart hammering, I continued, using my phone to take pictures of the foundation walls. I turned into a particularly narrow corridor that ended in a solid wooden door. It was different from the other flimsy doors in the basement. This one was reinforced with steel and had a large, rusty padlock dangling from the handle. The clang had come from this direction, and now, standing before the door, I could hear a faint scraping sound coming from the other side. Something about that door made my skin crawl. I should have turned back, but my hand reached out, almost of its own volition, and touched the cold metal padlock. To my surprise, it fell open in my hand, as if it had been left unlocked. Swallowing my fear, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, colder than the rest of the basement. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The beam fell on walls that were lined with old wooden shelves filled with jars. Dust covered everything except one area on a workbench which was strangely clean, with various tools laid out in meticulous order: scalpels, hammers, and other items I couldn't immediately identify. As my light swept across the room, it stopped on something that made my blood freeze. In the corner, propped against the wall, was a scarecrow-like figure. It was dressed in tattered clothes, and where its face should be, there was only darkness. A farmer's hat was placed jauntily on its head, obscuring its features. The air in the room shifted, and the figure slowly lifted its head, the hat falling slightly to reveal a face that was not a face but a void, an abyss that seemed to pull at my very soul. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming for me to flee, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The figure rose to its full height, towering over me, and began to move forward. It moved unnaturally, limbs jerking like a puppet's. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Only when it was mere inches away did my paralysis break, and I turned and ran. I sprinted through the basement, dodging the cluttered furnishings, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling steps of the scarecrow pursuing me relentlessly. I reached the stairs and bounded up them two at a time, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. Leaning against the door, panting and shaking, I listened for any sound from below. There was nothing but the hammering of my own heart. I stood there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Finally, gathering my courage, I opened the door a crack and shone my flashlight down the stairs. The basement was silent, the scarecrow nowhere in sight. Had I imagined it all? My rational mind grappled with what I had seen, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a figment of my overstressed brain. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I called a priest the next day, my voice trembling as I explained what I had seen. He listened quietly, then agreed to come and bless the house. When he arrived, he paused at the top of the basement stairs, his expression grave. "Something evil has touched this place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I will do what I can." The blessing took hours, and when it was done, the priest was pale and drawn. He advised me to seal the basement door and never open it again. I followed his advice without hesitation. It's been months since that night, and I've managed to avoid the basement entirely. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear faint sounds echoing through the floorboards, the distant clang of metal, the static of an old radio, the shuffling steps of something that should not exist. I shudder, reminding myself it's just the house settling, but I never go down to check. I moved into the house on Mill Road in late November, when the trees were bare and the wind had a habit of whispering through the narrow alleys at night. The place was a steal, really. Old, yes, but with bones that promised endurance and a stoic charm. They told me the previous owner was an old woman who died some years back, and that her family was quick to let go of the property. The house, despite its solid structure, had an air of neglect, the kind that suggested more than just disuse. It suggested avoidance. From the start, there was something off about the basement. It was an unfinished space, raw concrete floors and exposed beams overhead. The only light came from a single, grimy window and an old bulb that flickered more often than it shone. My first trip down was to check the old wiring the home inspector had flagged. With each step down the creaking wooden stairs, the air grew colder, denser. There was a mustiness down there that no amount of aired-out afternoons could dispel. The previous owner had left some remnants behind. A rusty old toolbox, a stack of yellowed newspapers dating back decades, and a heavy, tattered curtain that partitioned the room. I was examining the fuse box, a mess of old and new wires tangled together, when I first heard it. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I froze, the only sound now the erratic zapping of the faulty bulb above. Rational thoughts raced through my mind. A rat, maybe, or the house settling. Yet the noise was too deliberate, too heavy for either. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a screwdriver from the old toolbox, and walked towards the sound. It was coming from behind the curtain. My hands trembled as I reached out, pulling the heavy fabric aside with a force that betrayed my fear. Nothing. The room was empty, save for an old chest and some broken furniture. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding and laughed quietly to myself. Jumping at shadows, Mom would have teased me mercilessly for it. I decided to leave, my nerves frayed, the basement's chill seeping into my bones. But as I turned, the bulb overhead flickered violently and went out, plunging me into darkness. My heart lurched in my chest, the darkness absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. The flashlight on my phone seemed feeble in that enveloping black, but it was all I had. As I hurried back towards the stairs, the dragging sound started again, louder now, coming from all around me. Panic clawed at my throat, each step quicker than the last. I was close to the stairs when I stumbled over something unseen on the floor. I fell, dropping my phone, and it skittered out of reach, the feeble light flickering and then stilling in the direction of the curtain. There, in the dim light of my distant phone, the curtain swayed slightly as if disturbed by a breeze that couldn't possibly exist in that sealed space. And then, as I watched, paralyzed, a figure emerged from behind it. Not fully formed, more a shadow than substance, dragging one leg as it moved with agonizing slowness toward me. I scrambled backward, my hands searching desperately for anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around the screwdriver I had dropped. The figure continued its slow advance, a low moan escaping from it, a sound of pain and despair so deep it froze my blood. It was nearly upon me when I managed to kick my phone back toward me, its light landing on the figure's face, or where its face should have been. The features were blurred, indistinct, shifting as I watched, never settling into anything recognizable as human. Somehow I found my feet, my back slamming against the cold concrete wall. There was nowhere to go, the thing between me and the stairs. It was closer now, close enough that I could see the dark stains on the ragged clothes it wore, smell the decay that seemed to emanate from it. With a cry that was part scream, part sob, I lunged forward, brandishing the screwdriver. The figure halted, its moaning ceasing abruptly. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, the edges of its form blurring even more, until it was nothing but a shadow against the other shadows of the basement. The pressure in the air lifted, the overwhelming sensation of dread dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. I didn't stop to think. I ran for the stairs, up into the light of the main house, slamming the basement door behind me. I leaned against it, my whole body shaking, my breath coming in gasps. I stayed like that for a long time, unable to move, unable to rationalize what I had seen. I live in the house still. I never go into the basement. I sealed the door, moved a cabinet in front of it. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear the faint sound of dragging, the whisper of cloth across the floor. I tell myself it's the wind or the house settling. I never investigate. I know better now. Sometimes the past doesn't want to be disturbed, and sometimes it refuses to be left behind. When I signed the lease for the old house on Jackson Street, the landlord made a peculiar remark. "You're welcome to use the basement, but I wouldn't recommend it." His tone was light, almost joking, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. I brushed it off. After all, who needs a basement in a small rental anyway? I was just grateful to find a place within walking distance of work, at a rate that didn't break my meager budget. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was quiet, save for the usual creaks and groans of an aging structure. It wasn't until the rains came, a torrential downpour that seemed determined to drown the city, that I even thought about the basement. I worried about flooding, about unseen damage that could creep up and cost me my security deposit. So, down I went. The wooden stairs complained under my weight, and the musty smell that rose to meet me was overwhelming. It was worse than any damp I'd smelled before, thick and cloying, like wet earth and something else, something rotten. I flicked the switch at the bottom of the stairs, but no light came. The bulb must have burned out, I figured, so I used the flashlight on my phone to illuminate the small, cramped space. There was an old furnace humming in the corner, rattling on its last leg, and stacks of wooden crates that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The floor was slick with water, but thankfully not flooded. As I stepped forward, my flashlight beam caught something in the far corner. It was a door, half hidden behind a large, moldy tarp. Curiosity overcame me, and I pulled the tarp aside, revealing a rusty metal door set into the wall. It was odd, out of place in the otherwise mundane basement. I reached for the handle, but hesitated. The metal was cold, and a shiver ran down my spine, not from the chill, but from a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. Still, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, and revealed a smaller room beyond. The air that met me was even colder, a biting, unnatural cold that made my breath fog in the beam of my phone. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair in the center. It was an old wooden thing, peeling paint and frayed rope coiled around its arms and legs. The floor around it was stained darkly, with what? I couldn't tell. My light flickered, and in that moment of near darkness, a wave of terror washed over me. I felt a presence, as though someone or something was watching me from the shadows. The sound that broke the silence was soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing. Just the empty crates and the humming furnace. The whisper came again, louder this time, a raspy, dragging voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Leave," it said, and I felt the word more than heard it, felt it in the marrow of my bones. I didn't need telling twice. I backed out of the room, slammed the metal door shut, and raced up the stairs. I slammed the basement door too, locking it, though I knew that if what I'd heard wanted to follow, a lock wouldn't hold it back. I moved my bed away from the door that night, slept with the lights on and a chair under the knob. The whispers didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. In the morning, I called the landlord, asked him about the basement. There was a pause, a heavy silence that stretched too long. "I told you I wouldn't recommend it," he finally said, an edge of fear in his voice that hadn't been there before. "What happened in that basement?" I pressed, needing to understand. Another pause then. "Just don't go down there again. Seal the door if you have to. Some places are better left undisturbed." I broke the lease the next week and moved out. The last I saw of the house on Jackson Street was the rearview mirror image of its looming, shadowed form as I drove away. The relief was palpable, a physical weight lifted from my shoulders. But sometimes when the rain falls hard and the world is a blur of wet and dark, I hear the whisper again, rasping like dead leaves dragged over stones. "Leave." and I wonder what I left behind in that basement, sealed away behind a rusty metal door.